These weren't deli sandwiches wrapped in paper with your name scribbled on the front. These were slapped together in dim kitchens before sunrise, mustard on one heel of bread, whatever was left on the other. They fed welders, field hands, and factory men. Cheap, messy, real, and they got the job done. Dandelion greens with vinegar. Nobody planted dandelions. They just grew, and when money was tight, that made them the most reliable crop around. Dandelion greens were bitter, wild, and free, and when boiled and dressed with vinegar, they became dinner. You picked them young, before the leaves turned tough and angry, gave them a good wash to get the dirt and bugs out, then boiled them down until they wilted into a deep green tangle. Some folks fried a bit of bacon or salt pork for flavor. Others just added a splash of vinegar and hoped it was enough. The taste was sharp, earthy, and strong. It hit your mouth like a warning and went down like a challenge. But it filled you, and it reminded you that nature didn't care about the price of groceries. If you were willing to look low, it would feed you. Served with cornbread or a slice of white bread, dandelion greens with vinegar was never anyone's favorite meal, but it was there when you needed it. And in hard times, that made it special. Split pea soup with ham hocks. Split pea soup didn't care what day of the week it was. It was cheap, thick, and hot. And if you had a ham hock to throw in the pot, you were eating better than most. You started with dried green peas, rinsed clean, and boiled low and slow with onions, garlic, maybe a chopped carrot, if there was one, lying around. The ham hock went in whole, bone and all, bringing fat, smoke, and salt to every corner of the broth. Hours passed, and the peas melted into a creamy stew. The meat softened until it slid off the bone in rich, chewy shreds. Some folks added potatoes. Some didn't. Either way, it came to the table thick enough to stand a spoon in. You served it with crusty bread or just ate it out of a chipped bowl in silence. It didn't need sides. It didn't need help. Split pea soup with ham hocks wasn't pretty, but it was dependable, it was filling, and it turned the cheapest bag of legumes into something worth scraping every drop from the pot. Cabbage fritters. Cabbage fritters weren't fancy. They were desperation, fried up, golden, and crisp. You started with what you had. A withering head of cabbage, some flour, a few tablespoons of bacon grease, maybe one egg if you could spare it. You shredded the cabbage fine, stirred it into a loose, sticky batter, and dropped fat spoonfuls onto a hot skillet. They sputtered in the grease, smelling sharp and green and alive. You flattened them with the back of your spoon, pressing them hard into the pan so they crisped at the edges. No fancy sauces, no careful plating. Just a plate stacked with hot fritters, greasy at the edges, heavy enough to keep a man moving through a winter shift. If there was vinegar, you splashed it over the top. If not, you ate them plain, hot, rough, and good enough to make the house smell like there was something worth sitting down for. Cabbage fritters didn't cost much, but they gave you the sense, for a few minutes, that you were still doing all right. Still making dinner happen, still finding a way. Stuffed bell peppers with rice, no meat version. Stuffed peppers without meat sounded like a punishment. But when times got tough, rice stepped up and carried the weight. You boiled up a pot of white rice, soft but not mushy, stirred in diced onions, maybe a spoonful of tomato paste or leftover sauce from the back of the fridge. A sprinkle of salt, pepper, and if the garden was good to you, some chopped herbs or a bit of garlic. You cut the tops off the bell peppers, green, red, whatever was cheapest, and hollowed them out like little bowls, packed them full of rice mix, and stood them upright in a baking dish. A splash of water or tomato sauce at the bottom kept them from drying out. Baked until the peppers softened and the tops crisped just a little, they came out smelling better than anything made from scraps had a right to. No meat, no cheese, just a pepper filled with hope and starch. And sometimes that was the best thing on the table. Macaroni and milk. Macaroni and milk was about as bare-boned as comfort food came. You boiled macaroni until soft, drained it, and poured milk over it, just enough to keep it from feeling dry, just enough to feel like something warm and complete. A bit of butter, if you had it, a pinch of salt. Some people added pepper, some added sugar. Most did whatever their grandmother taught them to do. You didn't bake it. You didn't dress it up. You just stirred it and served it. It came to the table hot and bland, but there was something soothing in that. It didn't ask anything of you but a spoon and an appetite. Macaroni and milk was what you made when groceries were low and spirits were lower. It was soft, cheap, and filling, a blank page you could survive on. And when you had more again, you remembered how this little bowl had carried you through the worst of it. Mashed potato pancakes. Leftover mashed potatoes weren't thrown out. They were transformed. Mashed potato pancakes were second-day salvation, a meal built from scraps that tasted better than most things made fresh. You started with cold, stiff mashed potatoes, lumpy, buttery, maybe a little dry. Stir in an egg if you had one, a spoonful of flour, and a pinch of salt. Some folks added chopped onions. Others tossed in a handful of cheese or herbs when they were lucky. You formed the mixture into thick, heavy patties and laid them into a hot, greased skillet. The outside crisped up golden and crackly, while the inside stayed soft and creamy. The smell alone was enough to pull kids to the kitchen like a dinner bell. No need for sides, just a stack of hot cakes, maybe a dab of sour cream or a shake of pepper on top. They were cheap, filling, and made from nothing new. But when your fork cracked through that crust into the steaming middle, it didn't feel like leftovers. It felt like a quiet little miracle. Fried green tomato sandwiches. When the tomatoes were still hard and green on the vine but couldn't wait any longer, you sliced them thick, dredged them in cornmeal, and dropped them into a hot skillet. They sizzled in bacon grease or lard, browning fast on the outside while the inside softened just enough to bite. The edges crisped, the middle stayed tart, and the smell filled the house with something that felt better than it cost. You laid the hot slices between two pieces of white bread, maybe with a smear of mayo, if there was any left in the jar. Some folks added lettuce. Most just pressed the sandwich together while the tomatoes were still spitting heat and juice. It didn't look fancy, and it didn't last long on the plate. Fried green tomato sandwiches were born from impatience, necessity, and the knowledge that even unripe food had value if you treated it right. In homes where the garden fed the table and the paycheck didn't always arrive, this was a meal that reminded you the backyard could feed you just as well as any grocery store. Potato soup with saltine crackers. It didn't get much simpler or more stubborn than potato soup. You peeled and chopped potatoes rough, boiled them with a little salt until they softened, then mashed them half-heartedly right there in the broth. A splash of milk if you had it, a pat of butter if you could spare it. Otherwise, just water and starch, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing there'd be something hot in every bowl. Saltines sat in a chipped tin on the counter. You crushed them over the soup, letting them melt into the broth, thickening it just enough to feel heavy on the spoon. It wasn't gourmet. It wasn't even fancy enough to pretend. But it filled your belly, warmed your hands, and reminded you that even when the cupboards were thin, dinner still showed up if you worked for it. Cabbage and noodles, haluski. This was old country food brought to the New World's poorest tables. Cabbage and noodles Haluski, if you were raised on it, was butter, starch, and brassica turned into belly-filling gold. You boiled egg noodles soft and set them aside. Meanwhile, a whole head of cabbage, chopped thick, hit a skillet with butter or bacon grease. Fried slow, it browned at the edges, turned sweet, and filled the house with a smell that made your stomach growl. The noodles went back in, everything tossed together until it glistened. Salt, pepper, done. Maybe some onions if you were feeling rich. It wasn't a side dish. It was dinner, and it didn't need to be anything more. Haluski didn't try to prove a point. It just made sure you were fed, and that you'd want more tomorrow. Fried cabbage with bacon grease. A head of cabbage didn't look like much sitting on the counter, but slice it up, throw it in a skillet, slicked with bacon grease, and suddenly it became a dinner that could carry a family. The trick was in the sizzle. You wanted the heat high, the pan loud, and the cabbage brown just enough to turn sweet at the edges. The bacon grease did more than fry. It soaked in, filling every bite with the ghost of meat long gone. Sometimes you added a sliced onion, sometimes a pinch of sugar, but most of the time it was just salt, pepper, and whatever willpower you had left that day. Piled high on a plate beside a heel of bread, fried cabbage was proof that simplicity didn't mean weakness. It meant you knew how to take what you had and make it taste like something worth remembering. Cornmeal gravy over biscuits. Gravy didn't need drippings. It didn't need sausage. Sometimes it didn't even need meat at all. It needed cornmeal, water, and stubbornness. You browned a handful of cornmeal in a hot skillet, stirring it steady, letting it go just dark enough to smell like roasted corn. Then you poured in water, slow, careful, and kept stirring until it thickened into something closer to porridge than gravy. Salt, pepper, maybe a crack of cayenne if you were lucky enough to have a spice tin tucked away. You split open rough-made biscuits, flour, water, and lard slapped together and baked quick, and poured the cornmeal gravy over the top, hot and heavy. It wasn't silky, it wasn't pretty. It was thick, hearty, and stuck to your ribs like the memory of every hard season you'd lived through. Cornmeal gravy over biscuits wasn't something you served to company. It was something you served to family, to tired hands, to empty pockets. And for all its plainness, it filled you with a warmth that no fancy sauce ever could. Macaroni and tomatoes. There was nothing glamorous about boiled macaroni dumped into a skillet full of canned tomatoes, but when you were broke, it tasted like pure genius. The macaroni soaked up the sharp, sweet tang of the tomatoes, stretching a 50-cent can and a handful of dry noodles into a meal that could feed 3 kids and still have a little left over for tomorrow. Salt, pepper, maybe a knob of butter if you were lucky. That was it. No fancy herbs, no Parmesan showers, just tomatoey, slippery noodles on a chipped plate, steaming in the kitchen while the radio played something soft in the background. Fried salt pork with grits. Salt pork was never the main event. It was the seasoning, the edge, the crackle. But if you had a thick slice and some grits to go with it, you had dinner. You sliced the salt pork into thick slabs, tossed them in a hot skillet, and waited until they blistered and curled. The fat rendered out, filling the pan with flavor. While that sizzled, grits simmered on the back burner, slow cooked, salted just enough, and stirred until they were smooth as cream. When the pork was done, you poured the hot fat into the grits, stirred once, and plated the meat right on top. It was salty, rich, and hot. Grits soaked up every drop, and the pork added just enough chew to remind you there was meat involved. No one left hungry? Not that night. Bologna boats with melted cheese. If you were hungry and broke and had 5 minutes to get dinner on the table, Bologna boats had your back. You started with thick-cut slices of bologna, the cheaper, the better, laid flat on a baking sheet. Once they hit the heat, the edges curled up into little bowls, perfect for holding whatever scraps you had. Most nights it was just a scoop of shredded cheese, cheddar, American, or even broken up slices from a crumpled wrapper. You dropped it right in the middle and let it melt until it bubbled and browned, the fat from the bologna sizzling into the tray. If you had crushed crackers, leftover mashed potatoes, or a dollop of mustard, those went in too. But even plain, the smell was enough to bring the whole house to the kitchen. Served with a spoonful of slaw, canned green beans, or nothing at all, Bologna boats didn't apologize for what they were. They were salty, greasy, and full of character. Dinner on a dime, comfort without credentials. And when you took that first bite, crunchy edges and molten center, you didn't care how much money you didn't have. It just tasted good. Mayonnaise sandwich. It was desperation in its purest form. When the fridge was almost empty and the pantry had been picked clean, the mayonnaise jar was the last soldier standing. A mayonnaise sandwich wasn't dressed up. It didn't pretend. It was 2 slices of plain bread, often drying out at the edges, spread with a slippery pale layer of mayo. Some added black pepper for a hint of life. Others toasted the bread to give it crunch. But the core of it was the same: fat, blandness, and the soft squish of emptiness. Kids often ate it after school while waiting for dinner that might never come. It was a lunchbox filler and a midnight snack when paychecks were still days away. It left the mouth coated and the conscience quiet, because it meant no one was starving, not tonight. And somehow the tang of mayonnaise lingered like a ghost in the kitchen, reminding everyone of the line between getting by and going under. People laughed about it later in life. But in the moment, there was nothing funny. It was a sandwich that meant survival, and survival was sometimes the only victory a family could claim. Cabbage roll, casserole, lazy man's version. Cabbage rolls were beautiful. Cabbage roll, casserole, was practical. You didn't have time to roll leaves and tie them up nice. You had 5 kids, 1 oven, and no meat to waste. You browned a little beef, or none at all, mixed it with cooked rice, onions, and canned tomato sauce. Chopped cabbage got layered in a baking dish, then the rice mixture, then more cabbage, and more sauce. You baked it covered until the cabbage went soft and the rice soaked up all the tangy, smoky juice. It came out messy, bubbling, fork tender, and full of soul. You didn't care how it looked. It tasted like something much fancier. Lazy man's cabbage roll casserole wasn't lazy. It was survival with a little creative license. And when it hit the table, nobody questioned how much effort went into it. They just ate, and that was enough. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches, properly expanded. When the meat was gone, and payday was still too far away, you reached for the egg carton and the vinegar bottle. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches weren't fancy, but they were fast, cheap, and just good enough to feel like real food. You boiled the eggs hard. No runny yolks, no careful timing. Just a full rolling boil until they were chalky and firm. Peeled them quick, crushed them rough with a fork, and stirred in a heavy splash of vinegar to wake them up. The vinegar made the eggs sing, sharp and clean, cutting through the heavy yolk like a hot knife. You pile the mixture onto slices of bread, sometimes adding a pinch of salt, maybe a crack of pepper if the jar wasn't empty. The bread soaked up the vinegar, softening just enough to hold everything together. It wasn't elegant, but it was rich with flavor and heavy enough to quiet a stomach gnawing from too many lean nights. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches didn't pretend to be anything they weren't. They were sour, strong, and stubborn as the people who made them, and every bite carried a promise. You were still standing, and you were still eating. Cabbage and potato soup. You didn't need much to make cabbage and potato soup. Just a pot, a flame, and the will to keep moving. You peeled and chopped the potatoes, rough and quick. Then came the cabbage, shredded by hand or knife into thick, wrinkled strips. You dropped everything into a big pot of salted water or thin broth. Let it boil until the cabbage softened and the potatoes cracked open just enough to cloud the liquid. Onion, if you had it. A clove of garlic, if you were lucky. But the heart of it was always the same. A cheap, honest meal that filled a bowl and stuck to your ribs. Served with stale bread or nothing at all, cabbage and potato soup reminded you that the line between survival and comfort was thinner than people think. It didn't win awards. It didn't need seasoning secrets. It just needed to be hot, heavy, and ready by the time the sun went down. Lard biscuits with sorghum syrup. Biscuits didn't need butter to be good. They didn't need buttermilk, fancy flour, or anything from a store shelf marked luxury. They needed flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, and a good hard dollop of cold lard, cut in with fingertips that knew the work of real kitchens. You mixed the dough by hand, rolled it rough, and cut it into thick, squat rounds that hit the oven like promises you had to keep. They baked up craggy and hot, smelling like every good thing you still had left. When they came out, you split them open with your hands, no knife needed, and spooned sorghum syrup into the steamy middle. The syrup oozed into every crack, soaked through the crumb, and sweetened the air with the smell of warm sugar and hot bread. Lard biscuits with sorghum syrup were sticky, messy, and heavy enough to carry you through 2 chores and a skipped lunch. They weren't about celebrating. They were about surviving, with a little sweetness in the hard times. And sometimes that was enough to lift a tired family 1 more mile down the road. Mayonnaise and lettuce sandwiches. It was called a sandwich, but it was mostly a leaf and a prayer. You took a slice of iceberg, crunchy, cold, and barely green, and laid it on soft bread. Spread mayonnaise on both slices, just enough to make it feel like you had something creamy, something richer than you really did. You bit down through softness and crunch and told yourself it was fresh, light, maybe even good. Mayonnaise and lettuce sandwiches were summer meals for empty kitchens. They made the most of the produce drawer and the bottom of the mayo jar. And for a little while, they made you forget how little you had. Flour dumplings in tomato juice. When the meat ran out, but the hunger didn't, flour dumplings in tomato juice filled the gap. It started with a pot of cheap tomato juice, poured straight from the can into a dented saucepan, thinned with a little water if you needed to stretch it. You brought the juice to a simmer, bubbling slow, smelling sharp and sour in the warm kitchen. Then came the dumplings, nothing but flour, salt, and a splash of water, stirred into a thick, heavy dough you could scoop up by the spoonful. You dropped rough lumps of dough straight into the boiling tomato broth. They floated up fat and lumpy, soaking in the juice, steaming in the heat. Some folks seasoned the broth with a little black pepper. Some added a dab of bacon grease or a crumbled bouillon cube, if they had one. Most just let it be, simple and sharp, the dumplings soft and chewy against the tangy broth. It wasn't a meal built for joy. It was a meal built to survive. Heavy dumplings, thin broth, and a little heat, enough to trick a growling stomach into silence for 1 more night. Onion and tomato salad with bread. Sometimes all the garden gave you was onions and tomatoes, and when that happened, you didn't curse it. You built dinner from it. You sliced thick slabs of tomato, the juice running onto the counter, staining everything it touched, peeled and sliced onions so sharp they stung your eyes, tossed both into a big bowl, hit them with a glug of vinegar or oil if there was any to spare, and seasoned with salt and black pepper like you meant it. The bread was day old, hard around the edges, but you tore it into pieces and let it soak up the juices at the bottom of the bowl. Each bite was a slap of acid, sweet and sharp at the same time, softened by the bread soaking up the life of the vegetables. You didn't set a table for it. You didn't need a knife and fork, just a bowl in your lap, a spoon in your hand, and a hunger that didn't care about fancy cooking. Onion and tomato salad with bread didn't fill you up the way meat would, but it fed something deeper, the memory of sunlight, of dirt under your nails, of survival pulled straight out of stubborn ground. Onion sandwich. A punch to the tongue and a tear in the eye, the onion sandwich didn't pull any punches. It was the sandwich for the bold, the broke, and the blue-collar men who came home reeking of diesel and smoke. One thick slice of raw onion, preferably yellow or white, slapped between two slices of buttered bread. Sometimes it was salted, sometimes not. No cheese. No meat, just the sting of sulfur and the hope that it would fill the belly. This sandwich showed up in mining towns and railroad camps where hearty flavor mattered more than delicacy. It was a poor man's cure for blandness and a test of who could handle it without blinking. Some folks added vinegar or a splash of oil if they had it, but most didn't bother. It was a meal with bite and character, something to chew on while thinking about overdue bills and how long the winter might last. The onion sandwich didn't try to be likable. It was honest, brutal even, but it worked, and in a time when dignity was often the first thing poverty stole, it offered a strange kind of pride. You ate it, wiped your mouth, and got back to work. Liver spread on crackers. In houses where nothing got wasted, even the scraps of liver were given new life. Liver spread on crackers was poor man's pâté, rough, strong-tasting, but filling enough to make a meal when there wasn't much else around. You started by boiling or frying up the liver, beef, chicken, pork, whatever you could find cheap, until it was cooked through and crumbly. Then you mashed it into a coarse paste with whatever fat you had lying around, bacon drippings, lard, or butter if you were lucky. Salt, pepper, and maybe a pinch of onion powder or garlic made it just palatable enough. You spread it thick onto saltines or old biscuits, stacking them up until the liver filled the gaps between the cracks. It was salty, earthy, and bold, something you ate not because it was delicate, but because it was heavy and stuck with you. Each bite carried the iron tang of survival, a flavor that didn't apologize for its rough edges. You could feed 3 kids and 2 tired adults on a plate of liver spread and crackers. And in those kitchens, that meant success. It was food that came from necessity, dressed up just enough to trick the mind into calling it a meal. Scalloped potatoes and onions. There wasn't a casserole dish in town that hadn't seen scalloped potatoes and onions. It was a staple, simple, cheap, and stretched so far it might as well have been elastic. You sliced the potatoes thin, real thin. Onions, too, layered them in a buttered pan with a little salt, maybe a sprinkle of flour between each level, and poured watered-down milk or canned evaporated milk over the whole thing. Baked low and slow, the top turned golden and crusty, while the bottom simmered into a soft, starchy comfort. No cheese, no cream, just patience. You pulled it out when the edges bubbled and the smell filled the kitchen. Rich, savory, and just a little sweet from the onions. It was dinner by itself, or a side to stretch out a lonely pork chop or a spoonful of beans. Scalloped potatoes and onions didn't claim to be a feast, but it was hot, filling, and could feed 6 people with 3 potatoes. In a house where the lights flickered and the fridge echoed, that made it royalty. Cold meatloaf, sandwiches. Meatloaf always got better the second day, once the fat firmed up and the seasoning settled into every bite. Cold meatloaf sandwiches were about making yesterday's scraps into today's prize. You cut thick slices straight from the fridge, slapped them onto white bread, and squirted a heavy line of mustard across the top. No fancy toasters, no fancy sauces, just meat, bread, and whatever dignity you could scrape together on a Tuesday morning. Sometimes a slice of onion made it into the sandwich. Sometimes just a pickle on the side. Either way, it was sturdy, heavy, and enough to keep you moving until quitting time. Hot dog and potato hash. It was a scramble, a messy, glorious scramble of chopped hot dogs and diced potatoes fried hard in a big skillet, the potatoes browned and crisped at the edges. The hot dogs split and sizzled, their skins blistering in the heat. Sometimes an onion found its way into the pan. Sometimes a leftover scrap of cheese melted over the top if you had something fancy like that lying around. You piled it onto a plate, doused it with ketchup or mustard if you wanted, and ate standing up at the stove because sitting down took too long. Hot dog and potato hash wasn't a meal you planned. It was a meal you survived, and most nights that was good enough. Onion and tomato salad with bread. When the garden was all you had left, you ate what it gave you, and often that meant tomatoes and onions, sharp, juicy, simple. You sliced them thick, the onions biting back tears, the tomatoes bleeding juice all over the counter. Toss them together with salt, pepper, and a drizzle of vinegar or oil if you had it. If not, the juices alone did the work. You laid the mixture onto thick slices of bread, or used the bread to soak up the puddle of juice at the bottom of the bowl. It wasn't salad, the way fancy restaurants talked about salad. It was survival in a bowl, sharp, refreshing, and just heavy enough to remind you were still standing. Onion and tomato salad with bread wasn't built for presentation. It was built for hot kitchens with fans in the windows and not much else in the icebox. And somehow, on the right summer evening, it tasted like the richest thing in the world. Canned sardines on crackers. You didn't need a stove to make this meal, just a can opener, a stack of saltines, and an empty stomach. Canned sardines on crackers were the kind of dinner you could fix with one hand while the other rubbed the exhaustion out of your face. You peeled back the lid on the tiny tin, briny fish packed tight in oil or mustard sauce, and spooned them straight onto the crackers, one fillet at a time. Some people mashed them. Some ate them whole. Either way, they brought salt, fat, and protein to a plate that didn't have much else. If you had a slice of onion, you added it. If you had a splash of hot sauce, you drizzled. But most nights it was just fish, crackers, and quiet chewing. It wasn't pretty, but it didn't need to be. Sardines didn't apologize for their smell or their shine. They just fed you, fast and full, when the fridge was empty and the pantry echoed. Canned sardines on crackers weren't a delicacy. They were a defense against going to bed hungry. And for a lot of folks, that was more than enough. Butter and lettuce sandwich. Simple, humble, cold. The butter and lettuce sandwich was less a meal and more a memory of gardens that grew wild and fridges that hummed half empty. Fresh, limp lettuce leaves often iceberg or romaine, laid over a layer of salted butter on plain bread. No protein, no dressing, no frills. It was the sandwich you made when all the meat was gone, the kids were hungry, and the garden was generous enough to offer something green. The butter gave it richness, the lettuce gave it crunch. It was eaten by coal miners' daughters, dust bowl mothers, and millions of children who learned early what it meant to make do. Some toasted the bread, others didn't bother. Some added a slice of tomato if the harvest was kind, but mostly it was butter, lettuce, and hope layered quietly in a kitchen where the radio murmured about war, work, or wheat prices. It was the kind of sandwich that reminded you food wasn't always about pleasure. Sometimes it was about continuity, the ritual of lunch, the semblance of normalcy. And in that, it offered comfort. Banana and mayonnaise sandwich. In the rural South, it was practically a rite of passage. A ripe banana sliced lengthwise, laid on a thick smear of mayonnaise, and closed inside soft white bread. It sounds like a crime against nature today, but back then it was Saturday lunch, or something a grandmother made with a smile and a wink. The sweetness of the banana met the tang of the mayo, and somehow it worked. Or at least, people told themselves it did. This sandwich was born in kitchens where fruit was rare, and you didn't let anything go brown on the counter. Bananas were a treat, but if you had one, and not much else, mayo and bread made it a meal. It was soft, it was sticky, and it was shockingly filling. Some folks added peanut butter to bridge the gap between sweet and savory. Others swore it needed to be eaten with a glass of milk to wash down the confusion. These days, even mentioning it gets scrunched noses and fake gags. But ask someone who grew up on it, and you'll hear stories, not just about the taste, but about summer days, warm kitchens, and the strange alchemy of poverty and comfort. Mashed potato sandwich. Leftovers never went to waste, not when mouths outnumbered dollars. After supper, the cold, mashed potatoes went back into the icebox. By noon the next day, they became the core of a mashed potato sandwich. Thick slabs of bread cradled a scoop of cold, salted mashed spuds, sometimes smeared with mustard or topped with an onion slice. It was starchy, heavy, and oddly comforting. Some days, a crust of gravy clung to the potato and made it feel like more than scraps. This was a lunchbox favorite for mill workers, coal miners, and school kids alike. Easy to make, cheap to pack, and dense with enough carbs to keep the belly full. It wasn't elegant, but it did the job. Some toasting the bread gave it contrast. Others preferred it soft. It often showed up on Mondays, when Sunday's roast was long gone, but the potatoes lived on. The sandwich was a quiet reminder that in hard times, food was circular. Nothing ended. It just changed shape. Leftovers were sacred, and sandwiches like these were a badge of resourcefulness. Apple cider vinegar stew. This was depression food, sour, simple, and stronger than it looked. Apple cider vinegar stew started with whatever root vegetables you had, potatoes, onions, carrots. You peeled what needed peeling, chopped it all coarse, and threw it into a pot with water and a splash of cider vinegar. The vinegar cut through everything, brought brightness to the broth, and made up for the absence of meat. Sometimes there was a scrap of bacon or salt pork. Sometimes just a bay leaf or a clove of garlic. Most of the time it was the vegetables, the vinegar, and a long boil that made it something worth eating. You served it hot, ladled into bowls, and eaten with a spoon scraped across the bottom. It wasn't rich, but it was honest. It woke up your tongue, warmed your stomach, and reminded you that a little bite could be a blessing. Oatmeal and bacon. Fat. There were nights when you didn't have sugar. No brown sugar, no syrup, no honey. Just a sack of oats and the old coffee tin of saved bacon grease by the stove. You boiled water, poured in the oats, and stirred until they thickened into something heavy and plain. Then you scooped in a spoonful of bacon fat, greasy, smoky, salted from breakfasts long gone, and stirred until the whole pot took on the flavor of better days. It wasn't sweet, it wasn't delicate, it was salty, hearty, and heavy enough to anchor a man to the ground through another freezing morning. You didn't dress it up. You ate it straight, bowl in one hand, spoon in the other, standing at the kitchen counter if the table was already piled with unpaid bills. Oatmeal with bacon fat wasn't a meal you made because you liked it. It was the meal you made because it stayed in your gut like armor. It was heavy and plain and real, and it kept you going when there wasn't much else to hold you up. Burnt toast with milk. Sometimes meals didn't start with fresh bread. They started with whatever bread had been left too close to the flame or forgotten on the rack until it blackened and cracked. Burnt toast wasn't something you threw out. It was something you revived with hot milk and stubbornness. You scorched the bread hard, sometimes on purpose, sometimes because there was no one standing at the stove. Then you broke it into pieces and dropped it into a battered bowl. You heated milk on the stove, scalded it just shy of boiling, and poured it over the crumbled, blackened bread. The milk softened the crust, took the bite out of the burnt edges, and turned what would have been waste into something warm enough to quiet an empty stomach. Sometimes you added a spoonful of sugar or a pinch of salt if there was any left. Most of the time, it was just milk, bread, and steam curling up into your face. Burnt toast with milk wasn't comfort food in the way people talk about today. It was survival food, a way of refusing to waste anything and finding a little heat in a cold house when there wasn't much else to hope for. Oxtail stew with vegetables. Oxtail wasn't for the faint of heart or the short on time. It was bony, gristly, and cheap. But if you knew what you were doing, it turned into the richest stew on the stove. You browned the pieces first, fat crackling in the pan, then dropped them into a big pot with water, onions, garlic, and whatever root vegetables hadn't gone soft yet, carrots, turnips, potatoes. It simmered for hours. The meat slowly pulled from the bone, melting into the broth, until it turned thick, savory, and dark as leather. The marrow gave it weight. The vegetables gave it sweetness. The thyme gave it magic. By the end, there wasn't a person at the table who wasn't wiping their bowl clean with bread or fingers. Oxtail stew was proof that patience pays off, even if you started with nothing but bones. Baked bean sandwiches. You took a can of baked beans, warmed it on the stove, and slapped a scoop onto soft white bread, folded it over, no knife needed, no plate required. The beans were sweet, sticky, and heavy with molasses. The bread soaked it up until it nearly fell apart in your hands. It was messy, it was simple, and it was good. Some folks added onions or mustard. Most didn't. Baked bean sandwiches weren't fancy. They weren't supposed to be. They were just one more way to take a cheap can and stretch it into something that felt like a meal. Egg drop soup with scraps. This wasn't a recipe, it was a last stand. When all you had was a broth base, a couple vegetables, and one egg, you made egg drop soup. Water and bouillon made the broth. Maybe there was a real chicken carcass left from Sunday. More often, it was just hot, salty liquid with a few scraps of onion, celery, or carrots tossed in from the back of the icebox. The egg was the magic. Whisked in a bowl, then poured slowly into the boiling broth while stirring, it turned into silky ribbons that swirled around like something elegant. A dash of pepper gave it bite. a little vinegar or soy sauce if someone had traveled far enough to pick some up. Served in mugs or soup bowls or whatever was clean, it didn't look like much. But it was warm, nourishing, and felt, just for a moment, like a real meal. And sometimes that moment was enough. Peanut butter and syrup sandwiches. Sometimes dinner was 2 slices of white bread and whatever you could smear between them. Peanut butter and syrup sandwiches weren't glamorous, but they were fast, cheap, and just sweet enough to feel like you weren't scraping rock bottom. You spread a thick layer of peanut butter across the bread, then poured a ribbon of syrup over the top. Caro, maple, or homemade cane syrup, if you were lucky. Fold it together, and you had a sticky, salty sweet mess that hit the spot like nothing else. It was the kind of meal that didn't need heat, prep, or even a plate. You could eat it standing up, walking to work, or lying in bed after a long day. It filled your belly, gave you just enough sugar to forget what else was missing, and went down easy. Peanut butter and syrup sandwiches weren't about health or balance. They were about getting through, about feeding yourself with what was left in the pantry when everything else was gone. And somehow they still tasted good enough to remember. Canned tamale pie. It came out of a box, a can, or a desperate idea, and sometimes all three. Canned tamale pie was the last-minute hero of dinner tables that had more mouths than money. You browned what little ground beef you had, stirred in a can of corn, a can of tomatoes or chili beans, and maybe a dash of cumin or chili powder if the spice rack wasn't empty. That mixture went into a baking dish, bubbling and loud. Then came the topping, boxed cornbread mix, poured right over the top, thick enough to seal it in and fluffy enough to make it feel special. Baked until golden on top and steaming at the edges, tamale pie sliced like a casserole and ate like a hot meal should, fast, easy, and filling. No one asked what kind of meat was in it. No one complained it wasn't real tamales. They just ate it, smiled, and came back for seconds. Fried apples and biscuits. You peeled and sliced the apples thin, tossed them in a skillet with butter, or bacon grease if that's all you had, and sprinkled sugar over the top like a memory. They fried down slow, turning golden and soft, the sugar bubbling into syrup, and the fruit collapsing into sweet, sticky ribbons. Meanwhile, you baked up a batch of biscuits from scratch, just flour, lard, baking powder, and water if that was all the pantry allowed. They came out uneven but hot, split down the middle, and steaming. You spooned the fried apples right on top. Let the syrup soak in. Ate it with your hands or a fork, depending on how tired the day had made you. It wasn't breakfast. It wasn't dessert. It was just food, sweet, simple, and so good it almost made you forget how little was in the icebox. Fried apples and biscuits reminded you that comfort didn't need cost. It needed heat, time, and a little sugar. Noodle and ketchup skillet. This wasn't spaghetti. This was survival. You boiled a handful of dry noodles, elbows, egg noodles, whatever was cheapest, and when they were soft, you drained them and dumped them back into the skillet. Then came the ketchup, not sauce, ketchup. Squeezed straight from the bottle, stirred in until the noodles turned red and slippery. A pinch of salt, maybe a little pepper. Some folks added chopped onion if they had it, or a cube of butter to smooth it out. You let it sizzle for a minute, the ketchup caramelizing just enough to smell like something more than what it was. It hit the plate hot, sweet, and tangy. It wasn't trying to taste like Italian food. It wasn't trying to taste like anything but enough. Noodle and ketchup skillet didn't pretend. It filled the belly and stretched the budget, and for families who didn't have meat or cheese or even a can of tomato sauce, it got the job done. Cornbread pancakes. Cornbread pancakes weren't a recipe you measured. They were a recipe you remembered because there was nothing else left in the kitchen. You took cornmeal, cheap, gritty, and honest, and stirred it with water, maybe a little salt if you still had any. No eggs, no milk, no butter, just the barest things that could stretch into food. You heated a cast iron skillet, slicked it with bacon grease if you had it, or just rubbed it with lard or oil. Then you dropped spoonfuls of batter straight into the sizzling pan. They spread out into ragged circles, edges bubbling and crisping before you flipped them over with a battered spatula or just the edge of a knife. They came off the skillet golden, hot, and smelling better than they had any right to. You ate them stacked up with a smear of sorghum syrup if you were lucky, or plain if you weren't. They soaked up whatever you poured over them, soft in the center, crunchy at the edges. Cornbread pancakes didn't pretend to be a feast. They were rough, fast, and filling, fuel to get you through one more day without breaking under the weight of it all. And somehow that was enough. Dried apple and rice bake. This was a pantry dish, built from things that didn't go bad, even when everything else did. You boiled rice until tender, then folded in a handful of dried apples, chopped rough, a little sugar, a bit of cinnamon, and a spoonful of lard or butter turned it into something that almost felt like dessert. You poured it into a baking dish, baked it until the top set and the apples softened, then spooned it into bowls while it was still warm. It wasn't a flashy meal. It was quiet, simple, and sweet in a way that stuck with you. Dried apple and rice bake was what you made when you wanted comfort, but the store was too far, and the money was too short. And when you sat down to eat it, spoon in hand, it tasted like home. Sloppy Joe stretch, heavy sauce, little meat. You didn't need much beef to make a sloppy Joe, just enough to color the sauce. That was the stretch. Start with a half-pound of ground beef, browned and broken, fine in the skillet. Then came the bulk, ketchup, mustard, maybe a little vinegar or brown sugar, onions if you had them, oats, or breadcrumbs if you wanted to pad it out further. The sauce simmered until it thickened, coating every crumb of meat until it looked like more than it was. Piled high on soft white bread, or whatever rolls you could get your hands on, it oozed out the sides and made a mess that said, "Real food is happening here." Kids loved it. Adults leaned back full, and nobody asked how much meat was actually in there, because dinner was hot, sloppy, and good enough to forget the math. Cold spaghetti sandwich. Back then, leftovers didn't sit quietly in Tupperware waiting to be forgotten. They got slapped between slices of bread and became tomorrow's lunch. Cold spaghetti, sauce and all, was no exception. You'd take yesterday's noodles, stiff and tangled into little matted clumps, and lay them out across white sandwich bread like some kind of red-smeared haystack. Maybe a shake of Parmesan dusted over the top if you were lucky, or a slice of American cheese to bind it together. Most of the time, though, it was just cold pasta, tomato sauce, and bread. Kids brought it to school wrapped in wax paper. Factory workers ate it in the cab of a truck. It was messy, sure, sauce squeezing out the sides, staining fingers and lunch bags. But it was filling, and it was normal. Nobody flinched. Today it might seem like a joke, the kind of thing you'd see on a food challenge show. But for people living through layoffs, strikes, and months with more bills than paychecks, cold spaghetti sandwiches were just what you did. No shame, no waste, just leftovers turned into fuel. Navy bean soup with salt pork. This wasn't a soup for sipping. It was a soup for working. Thick, salty, and heavy, navy bean soup was built to keep you going when the pantry and paycheck were both running dry. You soaked the beans overnight, softened them up, then dropped them into a deep pot with chunks of salt pork, cheap, fatty cuts that gave up all their flavor as they simmered. Onions and maybe a carrot went in too. Garlic, if you had it. But it was the salt pork that made the difference. Melting down, fat rendering into the broth, meat turning tender. It cooked for hours. By the end, the beans were soft, the broth was golden, and the smell filled the whole house like a promise. You served it thick with cornbread, if you had it, or just a torn-off slice of white bread to chase it down. Navy bean soup didn't waste anything. It didn't pretend. It just showed up hot, hearty, and ready to do the job. Rice pudding as dinner. When meat ran out and vegetables were too expensive, rice pudding stepped in. Sweet, heavy, and warm, it was one of the few dinners that felt like a treat when you had nothing left to treat yourself with. You boiled white rice until soft, then stirred in milk, sugar, and maybe a pinch of salt. If the cupboards were kind, you added cinnamon or a handful of raisins. If they weren't, you made do. You let the mixture simmer low until it thickened into a creamy, sticky comfort, something between a dessert and a survival plan. Sometimes an egg went in to make it richer. Most times it didn't. You spooned it into bowls and ate it slow, letting the warmth settle into your bones. Rice pudding didn't care that it was dinner. It just did the job, filling you up with something soft, sweet, and simple enough to remind you there was still goodness in the world. And when you scraped the bottom of the pot, you didn't feel cheated. You felt full. Ketchup sandwich. This was poverty on white bread, pure and unfiltered. The ketchup sandwich was exactly what it sounds like. Slices of plain bread, often store-brand or homemade, slathered with whatever ketchup was available. Sometimes it was Heinz, but more often it was the cheapest bottle on the shelf, or even homemade from surplus tomatoes. This sandwich was the last line of defense between a child and going to bed hungry. It showed up on dinner tables during layoffs, droughts, or long winters when the pantry looked more like a shelf of empty jars than a source of nourishment. Parents told their kids it was just like a burger, just without the meat, and kids played along, licking the tangy sweetness off their fingers. In some households, it was toasted to add a bit of crunch, and in others, it was folded over to make it feel more like a real sandwich. The ketchup was sugary, acidic, and often watery, but it filled the stomach and added enough flavor to trick the mind into believing it was a meal. There was no pride in it, just resilience. And in a strange way, those who ate it never forgot it. It became a badge of survival, a taste memory tied to struggle, resourcefulness, and the stubborn will to get through another day. Rice and butter with cinnamon sugar. It didn't matter if the pantry was bare and the neighbors were eating better. If you had a sack of rice, a stick of butter, and a battered tin of cinnamon sugar, you had dinner that could almost make you feel rich. You boiled the rice until it was tender, grains puffed and clinging together in a warm heap. While it steamed, you dropped in a knob of butter, big if the week was good, small if it wasn't, and let it melt slow, pooling at the bottom. You took a spoon, stirred it all together, then showered the rice with cinnamon and sugar until the air smelled sweeter than anything money could buy. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't meat and potatoes. But when you sat down with a bowl of it, steaming in your hands, every bite tasted like a quiet kind of victory. The butter made it rich, the cinnamon made it bright, and the sugar made it enough to keep the cold out and the tiredness away. Rice and butter with cinnamon sugar wasn't a dessert. It was survival made sweet, and it stuck to your ribs in a way no fancy dinner ever could. White gravy and biscuits. Some days all you had was flour, grease, and a few scraps of baking powder to rub together into something that looked like dinner. White gravy and biscuits didn't need anything else. You stirred bacon fat or lard into a bubbling skillet, whisked in flour until it turned the color of toast, and then thinned it with water or milk into a thick, creamy flood of pure, peppery survival. The biscuits didn't need to be pretty, just rough mounds of dough baked until they barely held together, perfect for soaking up every drop of that heavy, salty gravy. It wasn't about indulgence. It was about hunger, about making sure nobody went to bed empty, about knowing that sometimes a plate of bread and sauce was enough to carry you through whatever the world had lined up next. Grits with bacon, drippings. Grits were the great equalizer. Rich or poor, north or south, if you had a bag of cornmeal and some hot water, you had a meal. But when money got tight and meat disappeared from the table, bacon drippings turned grits into something sacred. You stirred them slow over a low flame, watching the grains swell and thicken into a creamy, soft mound. Then came the real trick, taking a spoonful of saved bacon fat from an old tin by the stove and stirring it in until the whole pot shimmered with flavor. Salted just right. The grits didn't need anything else. But if you had a little shredded cheese, a fried egg, or a bit of leftover meat to throw on top, it became something that felt like a feast, served in chipped bowls or poured into plates and eaten with crusty bread, grits with bacon. Drippings weren't about filling time. They were about filling space. Real food, born from almost nothing, that hugged your ribs and stuck with you all day. Peanut butter and pickle sandwich. This wasn't a dare. It was a Depression-era miracle that stuck around through sheer audacity. Spread salty peanut butter on soft white bread, then top it with a few slices of dill pickle. That's it. The sharp vinegar of the pickle cut through the dry stickiness of the peanut butter like lightning. For some, it was a flavor revolution. For others, an act of desperation. Either way, it filled a lunchbox, silenced a growling stomach, and left a memory that outlasted hunger. This odd pairing was often born from leftovers, the last bit of peanut butter clinging to the jar, and a few pickles floating lonely in brine. The sandwich traveled in wax paper to schoolyards and rail cars. It didn't need refrigeration, didn't spoil fast, and made a little go a long way. Some added mustard for an extra jolt. Some swore by sweet pickles instead of dill, but the essence was the same. Salty, sour, sticky, survival. It was a sandwich that shouldn't work, but did, just like the people who ate it. Cornmeal dumplings in broth. When the cupboard was nearly bare and soup alone wasn't enough, cornmeal dumplings turned thin broth into something that could hold you over. You brought water or stock to a boil, sometimes with scraps of onion, maybe a bone, or bit of meat from a previous meal. Into that went the dumplings. Cornmeal, stirred with salt, a little lard or bacon grease, and just enough water to hold together. You dropped spoonfuls of the thick batter right into the bubbling liquid. They swelled up slow, soaking in the flavor and turning soft in the middle, firm at the edges. It was humble food, built to stretch, the kind of meal that didn't fill your plate, but filled your belly. Cornmeal dumplings weren't about flavor fireworks. They were about survival, patience, and the quiet kind of resourcefulness passed down from someone who never once wasted a bite. Spam and pineapple skillet. In the days when the war rationed everything and canned goods were king, Spam and pineapple skillet was the closest many people came to eating something that felt like a feast. You sliced the Spam thick, those rubbery, salty pink slabs, and seared them hard in a hot skillet until the edges crisped and popped. The smell alone was enough to fill the kitchen and draw every set of eyes toward the table. Once the Spam was browned, you poured in a can of pineapple rings, juice and all, letting the sweet liquid bubble up around the meat. The sugars caramelized, turning sticky and golden, wrapping the Spam in a glaze that clung to the fork and stained the plate. The salt from the meat, the sweetness from the pineapple, they fought and danced on your tongue, making you feel, just for a minute, like you were eating something fancier than the reality. Served over plain white rice if you had it, or spooned onto a slice of bread if you didn't, Spam and pineapple skillet was simple, fast, and loud with flavor. It wasn't Hawaiian luxury. It was American ingenuity on a plate, and it made you grateful for every single bite. Salt pork and beans. Salt pork and beans was more than a meal. It was a method. You soaked the dried beans overnight, not because it was fancy cooking, but because the beans were stubborn and needed convincing. Come morning, they went into a big pot with slabs of salt pork, fatty, meaty, salty cuts that were closer to preservation than indulgence. As the pot simmered low and slow, the salt pork broke down, melting its flavor into every bean. The smell filled the house and stuck to the walls, thick, smoky, a scent that promised something worth waiting for. You didn't rush it. You let the beans get soft, the broth thicken, and the salt pork turn tender enough to fall apart under your spoon. Some folks added onions, a pinch of sugar, maybe some black pepper or molasses if the cupboard was generous. It came to the table with nothing but a slice of cornbread or white bread to soak up the juices. It wasn't delicate. It was tough, salty, and heavy in the best way. Salt pork and beans didn't just fill a plate. It filled a family, a workday, a week, and in hard times, that meant everything. Tomato sandwiches with salt and pepper. When the tomatoes came in, you didn't need much else. They were juicy, red, and still warm from the garden. You sliced them thick, laid them on white bread, and sprinkled them with salt and cracked black pepper. Sometimes there was mayonnaise, sometimes not. Either way, when you pressed that second slice on top, the tomato juice soaked through fast. You ate it leaning over the sink or the counter, wherever was easiest to wipe up the mess. It wasn't a fancy sandwich, but it tasted like summer and survival wrapped up in one. Tomato sandwiches were what you made when the pantry was bare, but the backyard still had something to give. You didn't need sides, silverware, or a story. Just ripe tomatoes, soft bread, and enough time to taste what the sun and soil had managed to produce. In some households, it was all there was for days, but it was enough. Onion soup with croutons and broth. You took 3 onions, not because you wanted to, but because that's all you had. You sliced them thin, fried them low and slow in a little butter or oil until they went golden and soft. Then you added broth, real if you had it, bouillon if you didn't. Let it simmer until the house smelled like something worth remembering. Meanwhile, you toasted old bread, cubed it rough, and dropped it into bowls. The soup got ladled over the top, the bread soaking in until it barely held together. No cheese, no frills, just onions, broth, and the taste of getting by. And for that night, that was enough. Lard fried bread with sugar. When butter ran out, lard stepped in. When jam and syrup were gone, sugar took their place. And when there wasn't much of anything else, you fried up slices of bread in hot lard, sprinkled sugar over the top, and called it dinner. The bread crisped at the edges and browned in the middle, soaking up the fat until it was golden and rich. The sugar melted just enough to form a crackling top layer that crunched between your teeth. You served it hot off the skillet, fingers greasy, faces sticky. It wasn't light, it wasn't healthy, but it was sweet, warm, and fast. Lard fried bread with sugar was the kind of meal you made when you needed to give someone something to smile about and had almost nothing to work with. It didn't last long, not on the plate, not in memory. But for 5 minutes, it felt like a treat. Sweetened condensed milk sandwiches. There were times when there wasn't meat, cheese, or even peanut butter left in the house, but there might be a dusty can of sweetened condensed milk tucked away in the pantry. And if there was, you had yourself dinner. You sliced open 2 pieces of white bread, soft if you were lucky, stale if you weren't, and poured thick, slow ribbons of condensed milk right across the middle. The milk pooled, heavy, glistening, sticky enough to glue the bread together without even trying. You folded the bread closed and bit down fast before it all ran down your wrists. The milk was sweet beyond sweet, dense with sugar and fat, coating your tongue and hitting your stomach like a stone wrapped in velvet. Some folks drizzled extra sugar over the top. Others dusted it with cinnamon or nutmeg if there was anything fancy left in the spice cabinet. But it didn't need it. Sweetened condensed milk sandwiches weren't meals you served with pride. They were meals you served because sugar was calories, and calories were survival. And for a few sticky, glorious minutes, they made the world seem a little softer,